The next speaker is the Chief Security Officer of Huawei Technology USA, and he's going to have a fireside chat with my very good friend, superstar cyber rockstar, Mr. Cyber, my good friend, the CEO of Konfidas, Levi.
Good, it's great to be with you today.
Good. Can you hear us all the way to Washington?
Yes, I can.
Great. So good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to you in Washington, D.C. My name is Levi. I'm the founder and CEO of Konfidas, and with me is Purdy. He's the Chief Security Officer of Huawei Technology USA. I did say that correctly, right? Andy. And we are here today to have this talk, about 20 minutes, about what we call the rule-based order for a safer internet. In recent years, we've seen growing threats, escalation in cyber attacks, attacks against hospitals, private organizations. Some attributed to the fact that organizations in the last year or so have opened up because of COVID-19 to allow their workers to have remote access. That created a broader and much wider attack surface that has been exploited by hackers, both criminal organizations and nation-state actors. And we would like to speak with you today about what are the things that we need to do as tech companies, as nation-states, in order to create maybe new rules for a safer internet for everyone. So Andy, let me start with the first question. Albert Einstein said that all of our lauded technological progress of our very civilization is like the axe in the hand of a pathological criminal. What do you say about this statement?
Well, I think he makes a good point, although I think he overstates the point. Of course, he said this as a pacifist at a time where the world was facing tremendous threats from kinetic weapons and the use of technology to create methods for war. But in terms of learning a lesson, it's certainly important for us to recognize how technology can be used in harmful ways, how we as a society need to be prepared. We need to have an idea of what do we need to worry about and what do we need to do about it. And technology is an area, such as is pandemics, that folks have to take a look at what's the situation, what's the risk, what are the threats, what are the vulnerabilities, and what are the potential consequences. And we need to work together, not just within our countries, but we need to work globally to address these issues. And I think we need to do a whole lot more than the global community has been doing so far.
Absolutely. Let's discuss espionage a little bit. Espionage is always considered to be part of the game between nation-state actors. It is legal to do espionage. Some say that it's even good that we have espionage because that reduces the risks between nation-states. But especially in cyber, some espionage campaigns, let's say, have gone a little bit out of control. One example is the SolarWinds attack. The other one is the Microsoft Exchange attack that was recently attributed to China. And many say that those espionage campaigns have crossed the line. I will just give one statement. The White House said that the Russian SVR compromise of SolarWinds' software supply chain gave the ability to spy on potential and disrupt more than 16,000 computer systems. And they also say that the scope of this compromise is a national security and public safety concern because it places an undue burden on basically the private sector. Do you think that we should bear those high unusually costs, or maybe nation states should find a way to restrain themselves? Maybe we should have new espionage rules?
Well, I think we have to learn, as we'll talk about, some important lessons from those attacks where trusted suppliers were violated. And part of the reason the magnitude of those penetrations and intrusions, and frankly, what could have, those vulnerabilities could have been exploited to do the kind of destructive attacks that could be launched from them. I recall some folks talking about the fact that the global community either has to come up with a system that's secure so there is no espionage, or if you're going to allow espionage, everything is fair game. I don't agree with that. I think we need to strengthen the rules of the road. We need to dramatically improve our defenses and our collaboration within our countries and internationally. to come up with rules and much greater transparency and much greater accountability. And so far, I don't think the global community has really cared enough about these issues.
But if we take a look at the recent exchange vulnerability that the FBI was taking care of, one of the things that the FBI did is that they got an authorization from the court in Texas to remove those vulnerabilities that were actively exploited by those hackers. That's a very new thing that government do, meaning they take responsibility and do their part in the game. Any other lessons that we can learn from those attacks in your mind?
Well, I think the example you pointed out is one of the most important under-recognized aspects of what government did pursuant to legal order to help the innumerable victims who were penetrated. And I think there needs to be a lot more discussion and exploration, much of it behind the scenes, about how can those kinds of techniques be used to help level the playing field a little bit. But fundamentally, I think the lessons from these attacks where so-called trusted suppliers were violated and a number of the ransomware attacks is that fundamentally the defenses of organizations, government and private around the world are just not adequate. And we have not treated these issues in a way that shows that we as a society are serious about addressing them. The kind of thing I mentioned where, and I think the U.S. is going to step up and hopefully participate more actively in the global community on this, is trying to come up with requirements for key organizations that are part of the shared responsibility in cyberspace. We need to work together to figure out how can there be much more transparency, much more visibility about what individual organizations are doing or they're not doing. And we have to find much greater ways we can hold individuals and organizations accountable to do what they should do. But to date, we occasionally get woken up by a particular attack, but we automatically, we just fall back asleep and we're just not serious about it. And we really have to get serious.
Speaking about seriousness, one of the key issues that we have in cyberspace is what we call the problem of attribution, meaning attributing or saying with confidence who's behind the attack and why did they do it. Some say that governments are not being serious about this issue because there are very little cases that we know about actively attributing threat actors. I can tell you that at least in Israel, this is very rare that it happens. And without attribution, there is no law enforcement because you cannot punish. And without punishment, there can be no deterrence. So what should be the role over there of the government in being serious in their part in creating better security in cyberspace?
Well, I think the government needs to step up, the various governments, and work with the private sector to strengthen the international standards, to strengthen best practices, trying to come up with incentives and in some cases disclosure requirements and hopefully in fewer cases prescriptive regulation to set requirements for example, in communication, what the operators need to do and what the operators need to do to hold their suppliers accountable and what kind of visibility or transparency the equipment suppliers, for example, have to give to the operators so they can tell whether they're doing the right thing. And there need to be much greater capabilities for audit because we need to be able to have greater audits for cybersecurity and particularly in the US, much greater audits for privacy so we can find out when there are problems before really bad things happen. And as I mentioned before, there needs to be much stronger accountability for organizations and the leaders of organizations to do what they should do. And they need to be held responsible to do that.
But Andy, don't you think there is a moral issue that we put too much burden, I would say, on those suppliers, on the private sector, instead of saying, look, there are bad guys over there. Let's find out who they are. It's difficult. It's not easy. Let's find out who they are, but they're the bad ones. It's not me who left the door open who's the bad one. It's the thief who went into my house and stole my watch.
I think we've got really two major aspects of it. One is the one we were talking about before, is the need to articulate stronger standards, stronger requirements, stronger conformance, independent testing programs that apply to everybody, and much stronger accountability. And the international standards efforts, the participation in that is fundamentally important. I do think governments, but it can't just be governments. It's got to be governments in the private sector. We need to look at kind of the macro, the situation with cyberspace. We need to look at how to reduce the frequency, impact, and risk of malicious activity. So, for example, the network operators, the BCP rules require that if an operator sees malicious traffic from another operator, they're supposed to notify them of the problem and the information they have about where it comes from. And it's the responsibility of the operator who receives that information to do something about it. Similarly, internet service providers, they have great visibility into the bots, the hijacked computers and the networks of hijacked computers, the botnets. And there needs to be, and I know they don't want any responsibility, but there needs to be greater responsibility that the ISPs communicate with other ISPs. Here's the bad traffic we're seeing. Okay, now you've got terms of use that allows you to shut those down. Now either shut them down or we are going to block all the traffic that comes from the other internet service providers. So trying to come up with ways that we can drain the swamp so that we can reduce, as I said, the frequency, impact, and risk of malicious cyber activity. Because frankly, right now, the bad guys, including nation states, can hide in the white noise of cyberspace, and they can use unsophisticated vulnerabilities, such as the ones in some of the examples you mentioned, to do whatever exploitation they want. And then it's harder to recognize them as sophisticated malicious actors if they're using traditional vulnerabilities. So we've got a lot to do, and the government has to play its part, but it's not just about the government.
So, and one of the roles of the government is to create those rules you're talking about. So we know the Biden administration is recommending to create what we call a rule-based order, which we both agree is of paramount importance. Let's discuss a little bit who should set those rules. The US, the United Nations, it's a League of Nations, maybe it's the EU. How do we bring in China and Russia into those rules that the West wants to create? And what should be the consequences of not obeying to those rules?
Well, there are a lot of rules of the type that we just talked about. And so let me move up to the macro level internationally. As you know, they're led by a UN group of experts. There's been an effort to develop cyber norms and issue reporting since about 2015 on, I think, 11 major cyber norms of conduct. One of the challenges is we've got to have better ability to more specifically have technical attribution of where the traffic comes from, not just from within a country, but drilled down to a much more technical level. The criticality of creating greater capability is absolutely right. But I think we need to come up with some new ideas. So, and we need to bring together the traditional cyber norms, and it should relate to privacy as well. But there are some things in the proposal that the China government released in 2020, China's Global Initiative on Data Security. And some of those requirements basically said, for example, that a country in which a company is headquartered should not use or pressure that company to install backdoors or steal data or send data back. And there are a couple other very important provisions like that. I'm not saying that those suggestions in writing have any significance, but the point is we need the global community to sit down and say, okay, let's expand the traditional cyber norms that have been talked about internationally. Let's include private companies attesting and self-attesting that they will meet those requirements. In fact, let's go further. Let's use a combination of one of the most important rules for cybersecurity and privacy, and let's create a framework for individual global companies to sign not only commitments contractually with suppliers and partners, but mutual trust agreements with the governments of the countries in which they want to do business. And of course, when we're in like 170 countries, we are under the laws of those countries. But there need to be penalties identified for the kinds of conduct that the cyber norms and some of these other proposed norms would cover. So for example, the punishment levels for the violations of the European Privacy Directive, GDPR, are up to 4% of global gross revenues. Let's put those kind of penalties on the companies who voluntarily sign on and sign commitments to governments that they're going to be responsible. But let's also call on governments to sign commitments with other governments, sign mutual trust agreements where governments agree not to do the kind of bad stuff we're talking about and to make sure they only do the right kinds of things. And let's call on the government. I know this may be well in the future, but let's call on governments to sign these mutual trust agreements with other governments. And it should be the US, China, whatever, and subject themselves to the laws of the countries in question so they can potentially be held accountable.
Yeah, there was a trial made by the Russian Federation and China, but the criticism from the West is that they completely ignore their international law, and therefore it was not accepted by the West. But the question is how it will be done. Who will lead this effort?
Well, I think we've got to have major companies and major government representatives of the world. There were some recommendations in the report of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace last year, where folks will step up and let's build on the rules of the road in terms of major international standards such as 5G, such as for telecom equipment suppliers, the Network Equipment Security Assurance Scheme. Let's build on those and get independent nonprofits such as perhaps the Center for Internet Security, the Cyber Peace Institute. Let's get them to step up and try to bring together players to frame out, okay, what are the most important norms? It can't be everything. And let's come up with a framework of voluntary mutual trust agreements. And then let's work together to recommend that there be punishment levels attributed within countries to violations of those norms. So that's the kind of thing that I think can start the process.
So what you're suggesting is actually that the tech companies will lead the way and the governments will follow.
Not just the tech companies, but major companies that depend on information and communication technologies, major operators, for example, major equipment suppliers, and all of them, they participate already in the requirements, standards for telecom equipment. But getting a participation in these broader rules of the road. But, you know, the UN Experts Group, which has done great work since 2015, is basically around government action. Yes, we need to have commitments by governments, but we need commitments by private companies and start that ball forward.
All right, Andy, we have a very little time left, and we cannot not talk about the US and Huawei. So let me ask you, first, what is your opinion about what's going on with US and China on the issue of Huawei? And how can standards play a role in creating cyber norms around that issue?
Well, given the magnitude of the issues in the world and in terms of in the U.S., some of the activities coming out of the recent cyber attacks, President Biden's executive order on cybersecurity and an order on data security, there's a lot of collaboration going on to help develop standards, particularly around supply chain risk and software assurance. So I'm hoping and calling on the U.S. to work with international groups, international organizations, GSMA, 3GPP, other standards bodies, to help strengthen those rules. As we said, I'm also hoping that the private sector talks between the U.S. and China, which have been going on, the so-called Track 2, those folks have made some important recommendations for the kinds of things that China and the U.S. should try to agree on. I think the global community needs to push for trying to come up with agreements between the two governments, trying to get them to come up with agreements on things that matter and things that there can be transparency and there can be accountability for. We can't just say, well, everything's a problem, let's just give up. We have to move forward to try to agree, to reach agreement on these very important issues. And frankly, in terms of standards, U.S. government's had a lot of criticism of Huawei and China about, you know, kind of leading and dominating the world the standards efforts. The fact is the U.S. has dropped the ball on international standards. They've said they're going to participate, which is great news. U.S. needs to participate all in with allies and help support American companies, other companies, so they've got the resources to participate as well. Because this collaboration that have led to the current 5G standards, which will be evolving, of course, and the telecom equipment standards are very, very important. And the equipment, for example, has to be raised to a higher level of assurance. So companies, countries, including the U.S., major companies around the world need to actively participate in these standards efforts and come up with conformance programs so there can be independent testing to assure that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Andy Purdy, we've reached the end of our time. I'd like to thank you very much for this extremely insightful conversation. And once again, thank you so much for joining us at Cyber Week. And shalom from Tel Aviv.
You're welcome. Thank you.